In this video, I'm going to be taking a look at 10 vehicles that I want DICE to introduce into Battlefield 5. Some would be used by the current factions, whilst others would clearly be relying on DICE bringing in additional playable factions in upcoming chapters. I'm a realistic person and therefore don't really expect many of these to make it into the game, but in a perfect world, we'd all like to get to see the chance to try them out on Battlefield 5. Let me know if there's a certain vehicle you'd like to see in BF5 down in the comments. Let's start out with a classic, the T-34. Of course you're not going to see gameplay of this or any of the vehicles in this list, so I've included some other vehicle gameplay in the background, but there are some photographs to go alongside that. This T-34 was a Soviet medium tank and had a profound and lasting effect on the field of tank design. At its introduction in 1940, the T-34 possessed an unprecedented combination of firepower, mobility, protection and ruggedness. Its high-velocity tank gun provided a substantial increase in firepower over any of its contemporaries, while its well-sloped armour was difficult to penetrate by most contemporary anti-tank weapons. Although its armour and armament was surpassed later in the war, it has often been credited to have been the most effective, efficient and influential tank design of the Second World War. Noticeably, Operation Barbarossa, launched by Germany in 1941, saw the T-34 cause a lot of problems for the Germans in combat. Standard German anti-tank weaponry proved ineffective against its heavy sloped armour, and in one of the first known encounters, a T-34 crushed a 37mm Pak 36, destroyed two Panzer IIs and left 14 kilometers of destruction in its wake before a howitzer finally destroyed it at close range. In another incident, a single Soviet T-34 tank was hit more than 30 times by a battalion-sized contingent of German 37mm and 50mm anti-tank guns, yet survived intact and was driven back to its own lines a few hours later. Unfortunately, the T-34 wasn't as good as it potentially could have been due to poor strategy, inadequate training of crews, and abysmal quality of Soviet military leadership in the first month or so of the war. It wasn't really in the design of the tank, it was a very well designed tank. Yes, it did have some mechanical issues which led to around 50% of the tank's losses in fighting, but overall I'd say it was a really amazing tank and the design was absolutely superb. I'd love to see it introduced in Battlefield 5. Moving on, another tank, but this time for the Axis side it would be the King Tiger. Nazi Germany's Tiger is arguably the most famous tank of the Second World War. With its thick armour and devastating 88mm gun, the Tiger I soon earned a devastating reputation on the battlefield. The 60-ton Tiger I seemed to have it all: firepower, armour, and for an early 1940s vehicle that weighs as much as today's M1 Abrams, it was actually fairly agile. Hitler wasn't satisfied though, and he wanted a successor. Enter the Tiger II. At 75 tons, it was bigger than its predecessor. Its longer-barreled KWK-43 88mm cannon could penetrate 5 inches of armour at a range of up to 2 kilometers. With Shermans and T-34 crews having about 2 inches of frontal armour between them and death, no wonder they would run if they saw a King Tiger coming. This thing was unstoppable. No, I'm not joking. The Bob Semple tank is at the centre of many memes, but surely its inclusion would be well received in Battlefield 5. Everybody loves the Bob Semple tank. Designed by New Zealand Minister of Works Bob Semple during World War II, the Bob Semple tank used a tractor base and corrugated iron. It had no formal plans, no formal blueprints, multiple design flaws and practical difficulties. It was never actually used in combat nor put into mass production, but that's never stopped DICE in the past. Think back to BF4 and the Hover Tank, or Battlefield 1 and the Hellriegel. Due to the limitations of requirements and resources, the tank was a functional failure. It used a large tractor as a base and essentially was just a bodge job of poorly constructed corrugated iron and inadequate armour. It was really heavy as well, at around 25 tons, very unstable, and you can't really tell from the photographs, but it was the second tallest tank in the war. pretty crazy. It was only just behind the Char-2C, which we'll get to in a little bit. This thing has also been regarded as the worst tank ever built. Not the worst in World War II, just the worst ever. So having that in Battlefield 5 could be quite a pairing. Moving on to something in the sky, we have the Ilyushin IL-2. An incredible 36,000 IL-2s were manufactured, making this the most numerous military aircraft in history. It was called a flying tank because it was heavily armoured and had a great firepower from its cannons and rockets. Now, after a bit of research, I've kind of worked out that this thing was capable of destroying virtually everything in its path, but at the same time was fairly inaccurate. It's very difficult to find the exact numbers of tanks that it destroyed, but in some cases, during the Battle of Kursk for example, it was very successful. During that battle, they used a tactic called the Circle of Death, with up to 8 of these things forming a defensive circle, with each plane protecting the one ahead with its forward-facing machine guns. Each plane took turns leaving the circle, attacking a target, and then rejoining. One of the most decorated pilots to fly the Ilyushin IL-2 was Anna Yegorova. She flew a total of 277 sorties that included liaison, reconnaissance and ground attack missions before she became a prisoner of war after being shot down. She survived and was awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union in 1965. The Char-2C, you'll probably recognise this one from Battlefield 1. It was a super heavy tank, absolutely massive, and in Battlefield 1 I think we had it as a behemoth with the French DLC. It's the largest operational tank ever made, and 10 Char-2Cs were produced in total. They were considered obsolete even up to the Second World War. However, during mobilisation in 1939, all 10 were activated and put into their own unit. The thing is though, they weren't going to be used in battle, they were there for propaganda and were there for morale boosting movies, the sort of thing you saw a lot of during that Second World War. To the public, they obtained the reputation of invincible super tanks, but during the Battle of France in 1940, 6 of these tanks were lost. They weren't very good. However, it would be nice to see it return in Battlefield 5 as we had them in BF1. Moving on, we have the B17 Flying Fortress. In the mid-1930s, Boeing engineers suggested a big bomber to the US Army Air Corps. Early B-17s did not have enough guns and were not available in sufficient numbers, but as the war progressed, the Flying Fortress took command of the skies. B-17 crews faced unspeakable horror, pressing ahead into Luftwaffe fighters and flak whilst blinded by smoke, beaten by turbulence, plagued with mechanical mishaps, and paralysed by the numbing cold. On the first Berlin mission, B-17 crewmen killed in the air numbered the same as Germans killed on the ground by bombs. As the bombing campaign wore on, casualties aboard the B-17s remained high, but the bombing became more effective. Boeing's Flying Fortress was one of the most important bombers in history. B-17s fought in every theatre of World War II but won immortality in their epic daylight battles against the Luftwaffe, in which thousands of young American flyers lost their lives, transforming the impotent United States Army Air Force of early 1943 into a force of devastating destructive power just 12 months later. The P-51D Mustang. As the bombers of the 8th Air Force fought their way deep into Hitler's German heartland, it was the Mustang that cleared the skies. No other combat airplane of the war could fly as high, go as far, and fight as hard as the mighty Mustang, and anyone who knows about World War II will know how important this thing was and why it really should be in Battlefield 5. By 1944, the aircraft used the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, had a new bubble cockpit and increased firepower to 6 50 cal machine guns. It was now the best fighter in the war and fought superbly in all theatres as a fighter, fighter bomber and reconnaissance platform. I think this is something that DICE really need to consider bringing into Battlefield 5 because so many people love it, and it's one of those planes that you'd really have on a poster in your bedroom growing up. It's just an amazing piece of design and absolutely stunning. Moving on to a big one. The Mouse. Despite the name, the Mouse is not small at all, it's an absolute giant. The Panzerkampfwagen 8 Maus was a German World War II super heavy tank completed in late 1944 and was the heaviest fully enclosed armoured fighting vehicle ever built. Two prototypes were built undergoing trials in late 1944, and the completed vehicle was 10.2 metres long, 3.71 metres wide and 3.63 metres high, and weighed 188 metric tons. I don't really think DICE could introduce this into Battlefield 5 as a usable vehicle. Maybe they could if they went down a behemoth route like we had in BF1, but overall it would probably have to be a flag on a map, maybe a battle within a warehouse or factory where this was being produced, and maybe you come across this sitting on a flag. It could be very interesting. A little bit of trivia to go along with this: the mouse was actually too heavy to cross bridges, unsurprisingly, and as a result an alternative system was developed, where the mouse would instead ford the rivers it needed to cross. Due to its size, it could cross relatively deep streams, but for deeper ones it was to submerge and drive across the river bottom. The solution required tanks to be paired up, with one mouse supplying electrical power to the other as it crossed, and the crew would receive air through a large snorkel. It could go up to 8 metres underwater, which is fairly interesting. As I said, we'll probably not see this one in BF5, but worth popping on the list. From one behemoth to another, we have the Land Cruiser P1000 Rat. The P1000 was a possibly fanciful design for a 1,000-ton tank to be used by the Nazis, and surprisingly, Adolf Hitler actually approved the project, apparently. He had expressed an interest in the development of the tank, however it was later cancelled out by the Minister of Armaments, Albert Speer, in 1943. With a hull length of 35 metres and a mass of 1,000 tonnes, this vehicle is preposterous. Not all historians are convinced that it was really a real thing, and maybe it was just there as a bit of propaganda or something of a hoax. Even so, there are some designs of it you can see in the background, and this in Battlefield would be an absolute nightmare. Apparently as well, its top intended speed was 40 km per hour, which is ridiculous for a vehicle of this size, and I think they'd have had a lot of trouble moving it, considering the majority of tanks could be moved via a railway, and this thing would just not be able to fit. An absolute behemoth. Moving on, it's the Comet tank. The Comet tank, or Tank Cruiser Comet 1, was a British cruiser tank that first saw use near the end of the Second World War. It was designed as an improvement on the earlier Cromwell tank, mounting the new 77mm HV gun in a new lower profile and part cast turret. The gun was effective against late war German tanks, including the Panther at medium range and the Tiger. The tank was widely respected as one of the best British tanks of the war and continued in service afterwards. The Comet saw action in the closing stages of the war and remained in British service until 1958, however, in some countries remained in service until the 1980s. Pretty cool, in my opinion, one of the best looking tanks of the Second World War, and I'd love to have it in the game. So as I said at the start of this video, let me know if there's anything I've missed off this list that you'd like to see. A few people will probably go for the Panther tank, many others will go for aircraft that I haven't mentioned at all. There's so many things that could be included, but these would be ones that I really think I should go for, with a couple of wacky inclusions as well, just to show what is there and what would be possible. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.